Hello! Today we are weaving a baby carriage. The idea occurred after I had been asked to weave a cradle for a kid, so I realized it can be a nice gift souvenir. First of all, it can be used as a wedding gift, as it is usually used. It can be as well presented to a girl as a doll carriage. Or it can be also used as a cashew pot. That is why today we are going to think over the topic of carriages, possible ways of weaving, possible types of carriages weaving, especially the upper part. So I would like to share my experience with you. Besides, there can be different types of wheels, holders, etc. So today we are talking about carriages. We start weaving a carriage from an oval bottom. How to weave an oval bottom, possible types of oval bottoms you can get to know on our site. How to calculate the size of an oval bottom we have already discussed as well. Actually, you can choose the way to weave you prefer. The only thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that the lengthwise tubes of the base we use have to be double. As for the cross tubes, all of them are single except for the two extreme ones. When we start shaping an oval here, in order to get the intervals between the tubes more or less equal, we are going to separate these tubes and get the intervals equal without any additional tubes. So we are weaving an oval bottom. But first let me say a couple of words about base form. Simply and unpretentiously, for a small carriage, I use a form like this. Two small jars and a piece of cardboard at both sides. All of this is fixed with such construction tape, which results in such a small form. If you need a bigger baby carriage, you use bigger jars. Between the jars I put a piece of cardboard to avoid their knocking against one another, and use such forms as a base. Now we are weaving an oval bottom. We weave it in a regular way. Which type of an oval bottom to choose is up to you. The only thing I'd like to repeat is that the lengthwise tubes of the base have to be double, as well as the two extreme cross tubes, because when we separate the tubes and twine every separate tube round, we get the intervals between the tubes more or less equal, without adding any extra tubes. So the bottom has been woven. We have calculated the required size of the bottom. How to calculate the size you already know. We have shared such a piece of advice how to calculate an oval bottom. So we have adjusted it to the base form and continue weaving the base of a carriage. There are a few possible ways to pass on from the base to the walls. One can leave tubes this way, leading them over every other tube or every two tubes. Or you can just bend them and continue weaving. Choosing the way is up to you. This time I feel like making a sharp edge. By the way, these baby carriages have been woven different ways as well. Here I have lifted the tubes over every other tube. As for this green baby carriage, I have just lifted the tubes with no special transition and separated the following pattern with a rope. So you may choose the way you prefer. But here I'd like to make the edge more clearly seen, so we lead the tube under 2 tubes and lift it up. I lead the working tubes out right away to make the process convenient. Lead under 2 tubes and lift up. And this way up to the end. Under 2 tubes and lift up. Under 2 and lift up. Leading the working tube under 2 following tubes makes the edge sharper. And here we are finishing. You can do it with the help of a knitting needle or without it. Now you pull everything tighter carefully. Later, while weaving the following row, we will tighten what is not tight enough. And continue weaving the wool. I usually weave a couple of rows using the technique of a rope in order to make the weaving smoother. Then we decide which pattern to apply. So let me remind you, I have woven an oval bottom, then turned it over. Here are my working tubes left. What do I turn the form for? To continue weaving in the same direction. If I left the bottom like this, I would have to weave in the opposite direction. But because I always weave from left to right, I turn the bottom over and continue weaving. Here are 2 my working tubes left the way they were, so I continue working with them. Weave 2 rows in the technique of a regular rope. So we have woven 2 rows. Now I'd like to separate the basic pattern, printed cotton weave woven with 2 tubes, with a decorative edge, 3-tube rope. I like the way it looks separated with a decorative rope, either of the same color or different color. This baby carrot is going to be one-colored, so I just add an extra tube and weave a 3-tube rope. We do have such a tutorial how to weave a decorative edge, a 3-tube rope. So we have finished the rope neatly, laid all the tubes out. Afterwards we are going to glue them and cut the tips, and because I'm planning to weave in the technique of printed cotton, I usually help myself with skewers for barbecue. Because the basic tubes are not very rigid, they are identical with my working tubes, that's why skewers will be very helpful. I weave with moistened tubes, which makes the work neater. I have already told you how to moisten the tubes. So then there follows the printed cotton weave with 2 tubes. Because the number of the poles is even, I'm going to weave printed cotton with 2 couples of tubes at once. So let's start. And the second couple of tubes follows right after the first one. this way. Here the tube has to be lengthened. Keep the poles straight. I believe without skewers it would be harder. This way. Carefully. And continue weaving like this. Because we are weaving with two couples, the work is not going to be broken. It will follow the pattern sharp. I like this type of weaving because after a couple of turns a baby carriage is almost finished. So we have finished the first stages and woven such an oval basket. Now we have to shape the top of a carriage. The simplest way would be just weaving and narrowing the intervals between the tubes gradually. And then joining the tubes in couples. You can do it over some base form, maybe a balloon. As a result, all the poles meet here in one point. I have tried it and actually I don't really like this way, because the top doesn't look neat, and you have to decorate it. So the top is the most problematic part of a carriage. The place where all the tubes meet doesn't look neat. So I have tried different ways, and the ones I'd like to recommend you are as follows. Partial weaving, like the one we used to apply while making a cat's house. I mean, we start weaving using the technique of either rope or printed cotton. In this case I have woven in the technique of a rope. In short rows at two goals. Now you will understand what I'm talking about. This one has been woven in the technique of a rope as well. Printed cotton weave looks still more interesting. It is flatter, and I personally like carriages woven in the technique of printed cotton weave more. They are not so volumetric, but rather flat. So, we are weaving, marking the 2 points where we are going to stop weaving. Add the tube and weave in the technique of a regular rope up to the next clothespin. I'm going to place a balloon inside later. So far you can do without it. So we have reached the clothespin. Now let's turn. The tubes are wet, it is easy to tighten them. You see, I have turned and continue weaving in the technique of a rope in the opposite direction. Here I have to lengthen the tube.